Welcome to Beyond the Headlines. This is your chance to discover some of Concordia's top leading academics, some who are making news around the world. I'm Caroline Locker and I'll be hosting these conversations. Today, we're talking about child learning. So, as parents, we all want the very best education for our children, of course. But what if that education isn't found at school? In Canada, you can choose to educate your children at home. In fact, it's estimated about 1% of all Canadian children are homeschooled. In Sweden or Germany, for example, that's illegal. You have to send your children to school. But in America, it's quite popular to homeschool your children. In fact, about 1.5 million American children are homeschooled. So, which children learn better? Those who are taught in the public school or those who are taught at home? In fact, there's been very little scientific research on the topic up until now, and that's where we're very pleased to have with us Professor Sandra Martin-Chang of Concordia's Department of Education. Welcome. Thank you very much for being with us. Tell us how the different children performed in the three groups. The unschooled children, meaning taught at home with no structure, specific structure or curriculum. The structured homeschools, those whose parents followed the government curriculum, and those who went to public school.
Okay, I'll just clarify one thing. It's not necessarily that the parents were following the government curriculum at all. It's that they followed some sort of curriculum, and often it was self-made.
Okay.
Okay, because sometimes they had bought it, sometimes it was a Christian curriculum, or sometimes the parents had just sat down and said,
what do they need to know?
Let's do a unit on dinosaurs. But it was planned. So they had an idea of
some form
what
of
to do,
structure established from the parents.
Well, we had a moderate sample of our structured homeschoolers. So we had 25 formal homeschoolers.
Formal, so those whose
25,
parents established a structure at home.
And then we had a comparison group of children of the same sex and the same age who were attending formal or traditional school.
Public school.
Public school,
Okay.
yes. And we had equated for the mother's education, as well as we had done our best to equate for the mean family income. Okay. Although formal children attending formal public education, they tended to have two working parents, so sometimes the mean level of income was a little bit higher.
Okay.
And what we found in those two groups, and those are the groups I feel most comfortable talking about because we at least had an okay sample. You know, what we found was that the children who had been taught at home were significantly those going to public school. Yeah.
By how much? Like significantly stronger scores.
Significantly stronger scores in 5 out of the 7 areas. And again, this was in spite of the difference in income. And it wasn't even that. If you looked at the children attending public school and you compared them to the mean of the test, it wasn't that they were doing poorly. They weren't doing poorly, these kids, and which makes sense because this was a self-selected population. So these are people who invited us in, and so they were doing well too. Those kids going to public school, they were doing well. But it wasn't that they were doing poorly, it's that the kids being educated at home were really outperforming. In some instances, they were 5 grade levels, you know, higher than those kids being taught in the public school.
Wow. And you tested them, it was a standardized test, and you tested them at what age or after what grade? This is primary, we're talking about primary
Yes,
school
it was
kids.
primary, and we had quite we basically worked with the people who volunteered, so we had quite a spread of ages. So our youngest kids were in kindergarten and our oldest kids were in grade 5.
And then you also looked at the unschooled children, those who didn't have any kind of structure at home. For example, that mother you mentioned who looked at video games, but also some parents who decided they were just gonna get the child itself to decide what they wanted to learn. And what were the results for your standardized tests?
We only had 12 kids. Okay, so it was a very small sample, but having said that, I think it was one of the first studies that looked.
Yeah, I think so.
Because there aren't that many children in the population who learn that way.
Well, their parents don't volunteer for research, I think is often the case.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And how did those 12 kids perform?
Again, we had a comparison group with kids of the same age and same sex, coming from similar families. And in this case, there was a very small group, but we found a pattern where they weren't performing as highly.
Okay. significantly
Certainly,
lower scores, or?
certainly significantly lower scores compared to the those taught with structure.
Okay.
So we had those taught with structure who were very, very high,
Yeah.
and we had those taught with less structure who were lower, and then we had the public school who was more,
Somewhere
in the middle.
between. Okay, that's great.